$7:30 at night at the Pioneer Hall, 612 F Street. Tickets are $6 for adults and $3 for children. That's the 23rd.
Without a doubt, the Pacific Northwest is the land of giants. Hometown heroes, the Ventures, the Kingsmen, Paul Revere and the Raiders, Heart and Nirvana, to name just a few, have left their imprint on the history of global music and entertainment. In the incipient Northwest rock and roll era, a hidden world existed behind the bandstand. A world shared by hundreds, if not thousands of kids. As other kids were working in their local grocery store, gas station, warehouse, community center, or drive-in, a few inspired souls were on a road less traveled to creativity and possible fame, and they all had a critical part in this historic rock and roll story.
Now that I look back on it, it was probably as good a time to grow up as there could have been in the United States.
Here you had a bunch of us guys that up until that time we were all playing music in our bedrooms at home. And now we're actually on stage playing with a whole band and playing with a whole crowd of people.
It was no time to be a pansy about anything.
It seemed like there were at least 2 or 3 garage bands on every block.
Rock and roll was in its beginning stages. Everybody was just experiencing this new type of music.
Nothing was complicated. Everything was just straight ahead. Ba 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 ba.
I think the best years of my life were the years that I did play rock and roll.
The Northwest was where they nurtured us, they took us in, they danced. It was like, these guys understand what's going on here.
Looking back, it's almost laughable how many things were simpler in the 50s and 60s.
Well, I'd say that in the 50s, a lot of people were still blue-collar country folk. You know, a lot of them listened to country.
Seattle was not the excitement capital of the world.
In those days, there was a lot of, like I said, a lot of country music going on, and actually, I started playing country music because if you pick up a guitar, you learn about 3 or 4 chords, then you can go ahead and sing anything to it, you know, so country music was easy, and that's the way I started.
We in those days were cut off from the rest of the world. We have the Pacific Ocean on one side, we have the mountains on the other side, and we have this huge void between Oregon and Southern California, which was what was going on.
We were out of radio reach from the California radio stations. People just did not drive through. So we created our own sound, very unique sound.
Concurrent with America's new rock and roll art form, the local Northwest musicians were as talented as their national counterparts and helped to create a burgeoning social scene that rivaled or surpassed many other areas in the country. Everyone had a chance to rock on.
About how many people live in that valley?
The radio until the mid-50s had been the big console radio in the living room. And the family sat around the radio at night on the floor. The kids worked on their homework. Dad read the paper, smoked his pipe, and the living room had the radio in the corner. So now as radio begins to re-evolve, it spurred radio sales because people kind of liked this new kind of radio because you could have the radio in the bathroom and in the kitchen in the morning, and there was music and there was brief spurts of news and information and so on.
Grew up in Idaho, was into music at a really young age. This was before television. My brother had a little record player that would hook into the back of a little radio, looked like a kitchen radio, but it would plug in the back of it and had a little separate turntable. And he had kind of a little collection of Glenn Miller and Tommy Dorsey and that kind of stuff. And that was when I was in the, like 8, 9, 10 years old. And I just loved listening to music. I would play that stuff over and over and over and over. Rock and roll hadn't been invented yet.
I remember going to school and all the kids were bopping to Pat Boone and all that, and I was completely gagged thinking that, what about Fats Domino? What about Little Richard? Because we grew up around that. I mean, going out to the Evergreen Ballroom and hearing these heroes of ours.
Well, I'd go down to the record store and just get records. My friend John Duvall, who played with the Tikis and Fabulons, guitar player, he and I would just pick up records and kind of turn each other on to what was going on and learn them. Let's learn that. We could go to the basement and crank up the stereo as loud as you could. It would be distorted as could be, but you'd play along with them. That's just what you did. You played along, and you could nick every drum lick and nick every guitar solo there is.
I first heard rock and roll probably early '56 when a disc jockey by the name of Bob Summereye started broadcasting on top of a hamburger joint drive-in place out on by the Narrows Bridge in Tacoma. And he was playing rhythm and blues. What we thought of then as rhythm and blues. And I heard music I'd never heard before.
Rock and roll was fairly primitive, raw compared to what today is. I got most of my inspirations were music and drums and things through watching guys like that. Bobby Bland, B.B. King, Midnighters, variety of rhythm and blues, man.
The first time I heard a rock and roll song was, I was in the 8th grade at that time. I had gone home with a friend of mine. His name was Terry Radnich. We played in the Mason Junior High School band together. He had a drum set that he wanted me to see, so we went to Terry's house after school that night, and he had a nice drum set, and he wanted to show me how good he was at playing it. So he put on a 45 that he happened to have there, and it just happened to be the Wailers.
My mom, she had an instrument that was called a tipple. It's a T-I-P-P-L-E. And probably most people never heard of it, although it was made by Martin and Company. And she used to strum and sing. And that was my earliest influence with any stringed instrument. And she taught me a few chords on that, and I started out singing and playing with that. And then I'd meet somebody locally who played a few chords on a guitar, and we'd get together. And, it was a lot of fun around here in those days. A lot of fun.
My mom was kind of like our manager, unofficial. She would help out, and, my sister, and, Dad, and everybody would be down there taking tickets.
My mother knew, for my whole life, I just wanted to play music. And when the opportunity came up for me to go out, and, I was only 5 months away from graduating high school, and this opportunity came up to go out and make some money.
My parents were very proud of me in the way that I took my music and I used it, and I went on to earn a living doing it. The dances were not something that I would have invited them to.
I grew up in music all my life. My father being a jazz guitar player, my mother was country western, so I was kind of brought up, with music in the house, and it was just a natural thing to do.
My parents supported it 100%. My mother was a musician, and she loved every minute of it. My dad, he was, oh yeah, that's fine and everything, and it was cool with him. He kind of watched over to make sure I wasn't getting hurt or anything, but my mother absolutely loved it.
The Washington, Oregon axis of rock, where many successful regional rock and rollers would emerge from, had an established rhythm and blues and jazz scene to learn from. Beginning shortly after World War II, musical giants like Bumps Blackwell, Quincy Jones, and even Ray Charles, who spent time here on his way to stardom, left deep Northwest footprints and would influence countless young would-be rock and rollers throughout Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska.
For the big thrust of rock and roll bands, there was the rooms like the Black and Tan in Seattle, the Birdland, the venues like that a lot of groups with Dave Lewis played there. Ray Charles played there for years. The Holden family. Papa Holden is known as the father of jazz in Seattle.
Ray Charles used to live here. My first experience of knowing about Ray Charles was I used to go to Collins Playfield to play. All of us kids did, which was on 14th and Weller. And Ray Charles was playing in a club called the Old Rockin' Chair, which was a 3-story house converted into a nightclub. And if you stood on the street sidewalk, you could hear Ray Charles inside playing music.
Musicians would go to the after-hours club and see the guys who were working every night, kind of rhythm and blues, jazz. Those were, like real musicians. They really honed their craft and they did it every night. And it was a different scene for the dance hall dance bands.
Dave Lewis was the most influential musician, artist, I think, on the pop rock music scene when I first arrived in Seattle in the late 50s, and he carried that on through the 60s. He had a lot of influence on a lot of people, both locally and nationally.
Dave Lewis was all of our teacher later on. Dave Lewis was the first B3 player, B3 Hammond player I think any of us heard. He was a genius, and we all learned a lot from David.
Dave Lewis did bring in that big fat sound when he started playing that, and everybody wanted to adopt it.
Dave Lewis, I would have to say, it was the best job in music I've ever had. Dave was a consummate musician. He was the best boss you could work for, and he had a way of he could make you actually play better. He was one of the type of musician that made a mediocre musician such as myself play very well.
Dave Lewis, innovator. I mean, his band was the most professional in those days, 59, 60, 61. They were just, it was like Duke Ellington, in a sense. I mean, he just sang, moved. I mean, when they did steps, very subtle, but just into the groove. Beautiful.
Music is powerful, and rock and roll was almost immediately explosive and unpredictable. In the 1950s, rock and roll records blasted into the consciousness of the American teen audience. It promoted happiness, and it united kids across the country. Musicians were fans first, and their enthusiasm for the art form was influenced by a variety of origins.
A lot of the musicians that came out of the area at the time, you got to remember, this is like early 50s when they're starting to learn their instruments, and they're going to the Hawaiian Conservatory of Music and learning how to play, things like that. And so, it was a whole new world when the mid-50s when they started to hear the rock and roll and rhythm and blues sounds.
My dad's cousin played guitar and used to bring it to the family parties. And I was really interested in the guitar, everything about it, how it looked, how it sounded. And I finally talked my dad into buying me one, and his cousin taught me some guitar chords, and it's just been a part of my life ever since. At that time, I was probably about 13.
February of 1956 is when I started playing drums. I actually started taking lessons at that time. I had played alto saxophone before that for a little bit, and in grade school, and I took some piano lessons, and then all that time I wanted to be a drummer, and for some reason I was discouraged from that from some people that didn't think that I should do that, or for whatever reasons, and but finally I I won the battle on that and finally got the instrument that I really wanted to play.
My mother convinced my father that we needed a piano in the house. Like I say, there was no television when I was a kid. And so I guess I was about 8, 9, 10 years old. So I can't remember when. Things out on the piano by ear. I would just remember melodies and I would find it. And I was just fascinated with boogie woogie. The low notes on a piano ruled. That was it. That was it. Had to have it. And any variation you could do of a boogie woogie bass line on a piano, to me, was goosebumps. And I had to learn every which way there was. And I couldn't reach an octave because my hands were too little. So I learned to play with 2 fingers. So so I'd have octaves doing just the low part. I didn't care about the upper part. I just had to learn all the low stuff.
Music for me started when I was, I think, 9 years old. I started taking piano lessons because my folks thought I had a talent for picking tunes out on a piano. So I took 10 years of classical piano. And then rock and roll came along. It was just like this big miracle. We didn't have to listen to Jerry Vale anymore. And I got really fascinated with rock and roll, and I started, and playing off the cuff.
In the 7th grade or 8th grade in junior high school here in Tacoma, they asked me if I would like to join the band, the school band, and I said yes, I would. And they said, what instrument would you like to play? I said the saxophone. So the music teacher hands me a baritone saxophone. Well, the baritone saxophone was about as tall as I was at that time.
Going into high school, Lynn Easton and I were best of friends. He was a drummer. I played guitar. Got my first one at 10. Started playing in the band. Got a few guys from high school together at 14. And pretty much played all the sock hops and whatever we could play at high school. And fun. Just a fun time. Get together and play cold chicken dinners.
I started out in school band, and I just didn't like the band. So I just wanted to do. So that's how I actually learned, was playing by the seat of my pants.
I would say within 2 weeks of Dad talk Mom into going out and buying me a hi-hat cymbal and a snare drum. And I can tell you that I must have played Tall Cool 1,000. I played it for anybody who would listen to me. I had that set up in my bedroom up there, and I would play that over and over and over and over and over again.
Actually, I've always been involved in music ever since I was so little that my folks started me out on the violin, and I was too small to play it because I couldn't reach the end of it. And so I went to piano, and I remember playing my piano and practicing when other kids were out playing baseball, stuff like that. And I just kind of grew up with music. I went from there to singing in the choirs, which took me through a full scholarship all the way through college, singing at St. Martin's. So I've always been music. My dad and his dad go back to the old hoedown, North Dakota, South Dakota plains of banjo and piano and fiddle.
In the 50s and 60s, rock and roll permeated adolescent life, being a new and different musical form. Like-minded teenagers had discovered their own new secret language and found similar-minded friends. Whether it was in schools, basements, garages, or living rooms, these early bonds formed rapidly.
I was in a choir in Jane Addams, and we had these 3 girls that wrote songs, all played the piano, 4 or 5 rock and roll chords. I used to go to the rehearsals and listen to them and how they put these songs together, and they showed me how to play these chords. And one of the girls became my girlfriend, and I wrote a song for her. Oh, Cassandra, well, 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 oh, Cassandra. And so my next door neighbor, who was going to high school, said, "That's a great song." He said, I know a guy that got a set of drums for Christmas, and I know a guy that plays the saxophone great, and I know a guy that has a guitar in his house. He can't play it, but he has the guitar, and he went, "That's great." So they brought him over, and we had our first rehearsal. The guitar player that wasn't a guitar player, he sort of beat on it, and we learned 3 songs, and it was so incredible playing music you didn't have to read. And we were called Vince Valley and his Chain Gang.
Well, unless you want to count 3 years of accordion lessons starting at age 10, really started back the year I graduated from high school, 1965. And a friend of mine that we were both on the swim team at Mount Tahoma High School decided to get together at his place, and he had the big Lowry organ upstairs in his living room, and I bought an acoustic guitar, and we started doing Booker T and the MGs stuff, a little Green Onions and some other things like that. And then we decided we could use a drummer, so another guy from the same swim team, Gary Brand was his name, he joined us on drums. He'd been taking drum lessons, and we were kind of off and running.
A friend of mine, Frank Dutra, who was one of the original Blue Notes, the group after the ones at the Legion Hall, he and I were at a theater on 6th Avenue, and we saw Buck Ormsby and a fellow named Lassie Ames. We knew them from junior high school. So we started talking to them and started talking about music, and it turned out that Buck played the steel guitar, and Lassie played the drums, and Frank played the saxophone. So we decided to meet the next day at a cafe and talk about what we might be able to do. And so we did meet, started talking about it, and we decided to start practicing in my father's garage.
The first time I played in the group was just real exciting to me. It was like fire hit me, like, wow, people are clapping for me, because I'm part of this thing. They're clapping for us, but I felt they were clapping for me because the comments were so positive. I started thinking, wow, maybe I should learn how to do this so I can get those applause a lot. It was a good feeling.
I went to Grant High School. Norm Sunholm, the bass player for the Kingsmen at the time, was dating a girl who went to Grant, and I sat across from her in study hall. And she actually suggested to me that I go try out for the band when their drummer had been drafted. I really didn't have much interest in being a Kingsman. I was in a band that I liked really well, and I also was really into classical music, and I played with Portland Junior Symphony. But when she told me that I could make upwards of $20 a weekend, that's all I needed, and I was gone. I did the audition, and I actually did the audition in a garage. What better place than to audition for a garage band in a garage?
I just kind of put together friends, and we would go, sit in a basement somewhere and terrorize the parents upstairs and play loud and do, songs, Rock Around the Clock, See You Later, Alligator, do them about 200 times in a row, and all that kind of stuff. And it was all, like I say, it was easy to learn, easy to do. That kind of music, it was feel. It was more important the feeling you put in it rather than technical. Nothing was complicated. Everything was just straight ahead, ba 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 ba. And if you had the rhythm and you had the feel, you could sell it. You'd put it all together, it would work. Nobody could sit still when they heard it if you did it right.
So my first guitar was called a Dan Electro, and aqua blue. I think it was $115. You got a $40 amp, and it was cool. You could turn it up, learn how to play a couple strings, and down, 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 down. And within about 6 or 7 months, I opted to go for a Stratocaster, which in those in those days was around $230. My dad signed for it. I was on a $15 a month payment plan. I used to sleep with it.
I only knew one way to play drums anyway, and that was as loud as I could play them. I was competing with a brand new amplifier company. Norm Sunholm started Sun Musical Equipment, so he was making stuff 10 times louder, 10 times bigger than everybody, and one of the reasons I got the job was because you could hear me. I blasted the drums. And really, it was such a unique experience to see the Kingsmen that the same thing happened when we recorded. We just played like we played. You know, you would bash. And it wasn't that the music called for bashing, that's the way we played. You had to be heard without a PA system. And the way you did that was to bash. You know, you play as loud as you can, turn the amps up as high. If it goes to 10, make it 10.
When I was in Merrily and Her Man, I played a Wurlitzer, and then when we joined the Statics with the rhythm and blues, I played the Wurlitzer for a while, but then it was time to go with the B3 sound and the Leslie. So it took 4 guys to lift this thing, but we carried the Leslie and the Model D throughout, you know, all over the Northwest, and that was the sound.
That's the first time I saw the bass with an amplifier. The Ampeg had a B15 flip top, and that's the first time. I mean, this guy just knocked me out. So I went out the next day, traded in my steel guitar, bought a bass.
Fender Jazzmaster was the epitome of guitars. I mean, that was just the guitar to have, and you couldn't give away a Stratocaster. Telecaster was used in some cases, a lot in country. And I tried the Jazzmaster thing, but I bought a Les Paul. I think it was the first year Les Paul came out, and for guitar players, it was shaped like an SG at that time. And it's, I bought a Les Paul at that time and then broke the twanger bar, so I returned it and then bought, God, I think it was called an ES-125 semi-acoustic Gibson guitar. And so I went to different guitars at that period before finding one guitar and then never changing.
I was around the corner at a friend's house, and I walked into his house, and there was this guitar sitting on the couch. It only had 3 strings, and it was out of tune, because I wouldn't have known that, but it was out of tune. And I just sat down with it, and I picked it up, and within a couple of seconds, I had devised this melody that I liked. And right then and there, I thought, this is easy. I can do this. Went home, asked Mom, no, get out of here. Went to my grandmother, sure. And she bought me this guitar, an acoustic, a K jumbo arch top that was probably as big as I was.
Well, no, the crowds weren't quiet. I'll say that. We just, in those days, we started off, I remember, with amplifiers, the old-fashioned Bogan amplifiers that I believe our first amplifier was about 60, 70 watts. Then we graduated to 100 watts, then 150, and eventually went up. But it was like old 26-inch university horns on each end of the stage. And it worked. I don't know how it did, but it did.
In the 60s, AM radio was everything to teenagers. And Seattle's powerhouse, KJR Radio, was one of the top stations in the country. Of course, KJR's Pat O'Day was intimately involved with the entire music scene, and many local bands heard themselves on the radio, and this helped them to become regional stars.
Channel 95. We had access to recording studios, so we could record reasonably inexpensively a group or an artist. It didn't cost that much to put out a 45. You didn't have to record a whole album. You basically recorded one song and then maybe had something throwaway for the B-side. So you had this little 45 that you don't have a ton of investment in, and are able to take down to the local radio station, and if they liked it, whether it's Pat O'Day or whomever it was, immediately would get on the air, immediately would get the exposure. And if it was successful in Seattle, you could convince a national label or someone else to become interested in your product. So it was basically what other products do, test market.
Well, radio was how we heard what was going on, what the hit songs were, trying to find those songs that we thought we could duplicate, that we could perform at a dance. Which songs were danceable, which songs we thought we could learn, songs that, kind of turned our crank.
Up there with Elvis Presley, I mean, he's number 3 and we're number 2, and then he switches to number 1 and back and forth. Yeah, that was quite something. We certainly never expected that.
First started getting airplayed, we noticed just a huge difference. All of a sudden, instead of us going out and procuring work, trying to find work, it essentially all came to us.
All the rock and roll was on radio. That's where you really were exposed to it, you know. Record stores, yeah, but you went into record stores looking for stuff you heard on the radio. KISN was a blaster here in Portland, and they really had it going.
Radio was really the thing that began it for all of us, and there was a radio everywhere you went. There were radios playing at the drive-ins, there were radios in our cars, not the kind of stereo that you have now, but just the radio was a very important piece.
Radio was everything. Even as a little kid, I guess it was meant for me to be, because I used to, and I had to go to bed and lights off, but I used to get in bed and I had my little pretend to be asleep, and then I would listen to the radio.
At the recording session, when I heard them all talking, I said, well, are we actually going to have a record? They said, oh yeah, you're going to have a record out. So when it came out, we went up and got a box of them, which was hard to get from those guys. And we were coming back into Tacoma. We got this box of records, see? And we saw MO Radio out here. Let's pull over there and see if they'll play our records. And so we went in, and this disc jockey was in there, and we held up the record, and he goes, come on in here. So we went in, and he said, what do you got there? We said, we got our new record. And he'd heard of us, So he said, well, I'm going to play your record. We said, well, wait till we call our girlfriends. So we all called our girlfriends and said, go ahead and play it now. So that was our first time getting a record played. It was a huge record in Seattle and Tacoma and like that. And then after it looked like it wasn't going to happen. And after about 2 months, I got a call from Bob Reisdorf, and it had gone onto the national charts, where it got up in the 50s, and stayed on for, 6-8 weeks. That's a big star for a minute. That's a, one-hit wonder.
In one of my early recordings for Jan Skookstead, he had a recording studio in the North End, and he gave me a chance to do some recording. Somehow he got the thing on the radio, and I was just driving down the street, and I heard myself on the radio, and boy, I just got real happy in the car, I think it only played a couple of times on the radio, but it got on the musical charts in Seattle. That was my claim to fame.
I remember the first time I heard me and the band, we were coming out of Spokane. And we had just, it was the Owl and the Pussy, and we were big in Spokane. We were, Eastern Washington's group. And we were driving out of town, heading home. We just played the Armory, I think it was the Armory in Spokane, and we were driving home and had the radio on, and they came on and said, here's the new record, you just saw them tonight at the Armory or whatever it is, here's the Bards. And we were just so excited, it was just screaming, there we are. It was a big moment.
First time I heard Angel of the Morning on the radio was the record had been taken down to Pat O'Day, and I was home, and he played it. He actually played my record, and it was just unbelievable. Unbelievable to hear my record on that record in particular, because it was my first national recording.
We were still working as laborers when Walk Don't Run was #1 in Seattle. And I remember one time we were so excited about it that I had a little portable radio. And I'm up on the roof working, and I'm working with a guy that was new. And Walk Don't Run came on, and I said, hey, that's my record. And he said, yeah, sure. Hey, what are you doing up here on the roof? It was a funny situation, but that's the way it was.
I remember hearing Jolly Green Giant as we were riding through the Midwest, and these guys were screaming and yelling about what a great song this was. I remember hearing Money for the first time, driving through the Midwest in that old green Pontiac thinking, oh, that's us. And you know, the weird thing is, you hear Louie Louie for the first time on the radio. Whatever it is, you've already heard this thing 1,000 times, but yet you turn it up because the way they limit it, the way they blast it, the way it came over that little stupid speaker, it's its own experience. You just can't describe how excited you are, and you're going to listen to the whole thing. You know, we've already listened to it, we've already played it 100 times, but you have to listen to the whole thing on the radio. I remember there was this place here in Portland called Yaws, which was the hangout. You drove your car over, you had your radio blasting, you ordered your little hamburger or your fries or your cherry Coke or whatever, and that's where all the kids were. And when your record came on the radio and you were there, you were a star. I mean, people just gathered, that's the guy, you know. It was really fun, especially when you heard your records at Yaws blasting over Kissing. I know for a fact that our guys in our band, I think I probably did it too, but maybe not, I had more class. But I know for a fact some of us would call Kissing and request our own songs so that we could go down to Yaws and hear them and pick up girls. Great fun.
Demand for rock and roll was huge, and it seemed like every locale in the Northwest had a need for dances and live music. Distances could be far, and until the mid-'60s advent of interstate highway systems, travel was tedious, sometimes daunting, and time-consuming.
All righty. Peace. You gentlemen came a long way. Have you ever been to Philadelphia before?
We went back east. We toured all through the east, and first of all, we went back and did the American Bandstand when it was in Philadelphia. We were on the Alan Freed show and a couple other shows that were pretty classic back there. And we were just a bunch of kids in a brand new 59 Plymouth Fury station wagon. Actually, there was 7 of us all together because we brought my mother, and we also brought a guy named Gary Favier, who had kind of filtered into the band, who was a singer, kind of thought he was Elvis type of guy. And so he sang as part of the show. So anyway, we went from, and back then they didn't have really big shows. We played little resorts and places like that, and well, some of them were outdoor things. But we were kind of lost. I mean, we were just kind of following our nose. We'd be late for one and make up for it, and consequently be late for another one somewhere, and it was kind of crazy.
We all traveled in cars and station wagons. James Brown show had a bus and about 3 Cadillacs. But we were in my station wagon, and we did the Chitlin circuit, like I said, and the Apollo the first time before it closed. And, it was so much fun, you know, but it was hard work.
We traveled as far as our little VW bus would take us. We traveled the Northwest. We rarely got into Idaho or Montana, but we did Oregon. We did the EJD dances down there, and we did Spokane a lot, the Armory, just basically the Northwest that Paul Revere was doing. He got a little farther out because he was from Idaho.
We're still talking about rock and roll genesis here. We drove. We had a car, station wagon, and a trailer for our first tour. For our second tour, we took a van and a car. We found that to be quite troublesome because we kept hitting ourselves. You get in a snowstorm and the van would run into the back of the car, or the car would run into the van, or the van would run into someone else, or someone would get distracted and start following the wrong car because they were rental vehicles. And we ended up, before our first year, we had a bus, and we were all in one bus, and that really worked well for us. I think we were probably the first act that had their own bus. We ran into country artists and rock and roll people out on the road. and they would be amazed that we actually had a bus, and then the next time we saw them, they would have a bus. My father worked for Greyhound, and he's the one that got us a bus and really said, why don't you guys all travel in a great big deal and just take the seats out? And it was great.
You lived on the bus and traveled 800 miles a day, stayed in a motel that night if you could find one, or went right on and played and then drove on to the next city. It was pretty intense. You could do it because you were young enough to do it and you wanted to be out there so bad to play. So it worked out. The life of most bands is 5 years, and 5 years in a bus is a long, long time.
Mainly toured with bus tours, but we'd have a bus with bunks on it. We'd fly to different places. We basically played a half hour, sometimes 45 minutes, mostly a half hour at the end of a show. The concerts had 5, 6, 7 acts on them. It was a piece of cake. I mean, compared to Dawn of the Good Times, where you were driving for hours and you played a 3-hour dance.
When we did the Alan Freed show, that was a big deal. Actually, there are so few groups of our type that played the Alan Freed show. Those are mostly R&B bands that played there. And it was really a unique situation for us to play there, and it was really an honor to play Alan Freed, being that he's the guy that, from what my understanding is, he coined the term rock and roll. How much better can it get?
I had an Oldsmobile Super 88, all power, all leather. Hey, thing would go flat out, 110 miles an hour. And we take that sometimes. Sometimes we take Jerry Rosalie's GTO, whichever we thought would get the attention of the girls sometimes.
We used to rented a Beechcraft Debonair.
Yeah, we used to fly.
We did a lot of one-nighters, and the guys in the band would get in the Beechcraft, and we'd fly the next place, and then the guys in the truck would fly it there. I'd always arrive there sick. I always got air sick.
We were only able to fly what they call visual, and so a lot of times we'd rent a plane from somewhere in Tacoma, fly to the gig, and then we'd meet the truck wherever it happened to be. The truck would take days to get there, and we'd be there in a couple hours, sicker than a dog, usually. Anytime you flew east of the mountains, you'd run into all these thermals and hammer you to death. I remember more than once getting out of the plane and lying down under the wing and just spending about an hour getting my stomach back together. I remember one time flying to somewhere east of the mountains, and I was asleep. I was sitting in the co-pilot seat with my head up against the plexiglass. All of a sudden, it occurred to me that I didn't feel the vibration and I didn't hear the hum of the engine. I woke up, looked out the front window, and the propeller is motionless. Here's Rob over there fooling with every control he had on the dashboard, trying to get the air-fuel mixture together again to get this plane started. He hands me the microphone, tells me to call the emergency airstrip at Bandera, Mayday, Mayday, and all that. My heart's going like this. An hour later, we'd forgotten all about it. To be young again, you're indestructible. Today, I get on an airplane, I'm scared to death.
we must have strange booking. Might play, I don't know, up in Bellingham or Birch Bay one night, and then expect to be down in maybe Northern California the next, and then over to Montana. I don't know who booked us on that kind of route.
Commercial recording studios were relatively new in the 50s and 60s outside of New York, Los Angeles, and Nashville. Early regional acts recorded at radio stations, but an independent studio in West Seattle that created the original Northwest magic would be Joe Boll's studio in West Seattle. Other notable studios with regional success were Northwest Recorders, Carney Barton's audio recording in Seattle, and studios in Boise and Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, as well as Portland and Eugene, Oregon, and many others, even Wenatchee, Washington. Special mention must be made for Barton. His recording and production was notable in that he was the first to capture the energy, the rawness, and the power of early rock and roll in the studio that few were able to do then or now.
The primary benefit from jumping from a local or regional label to a national label is distribution. Now, the group may not make a dime more because of it, but they will get the publicity. And at the time, it wasn't so much what they got out of the sales that they were striving for. What made it all worthwhile is the tour dates. They would get the concerts. And even if they weren't getting paid properly on the record sales, just the fact that they had those records and the national label had the distribution, they would then get tour dates.
Well, in those days, you know, the recording part of it was almost nil, except on special occasions, you know, because of course it was the analog and reel-to-reel recorders. It wasn't very good, you know. I mean, to get something that was real good, you'd have to hire somebody who had real good equipment.
Recording was quite archaic and basic compared to what it is today, but the good part about it, in my opinion, is that it was really pure, because it was simple, and you were just using a handful of microphones, and you were recording either on 2-track or 3-track. So a lot of the work on getting levels and getting things to fit in a mix, you did live, as opposed to now, you can do it on many tracks and all kinds of magic. But at that time, the live aspect, I think, was something that records really miss today.
We've been making some demo records in the big city of Seattle. There was essentially nothing in Tacoma like that at all in those days, and that was 1958. We went to Seattle. Our recording engineer, by the name of Kearney Barton, we went and paid him for studio time and recorded a record called Scotch on the Rocks. In those days, that was quite a risque title for a tune. We had to change the name to Tall Goolin. You would never get airplay with anything drug-related, such as Scotch on the Rocks.
One of the first rock bands that I worked with that really played full bore and let her rip was the Kingsmen, and then later the Sonics. But the Kingsmen came in after a road trip, and were doing some recording, and they had torn the speaker on the guitar amp, and figured, what the heck, go for it. And when it hadn't played that way, and that was the first real fuzz tone that was recorded in this area anyway, and it was because the speaker itself was torn, so you got this, and that was part of the great sound. And so after that, they incorporated it a lot.
If you've ever watched an old science fiction movie with the big knobs, it was a 3-track studio, and actually you could bounce back and forth and overdub if you were experienced at it. But it cost us $45 or less, $36, whatever it was, and 45 minutes to do the whole session.
I had, on my own, put my band on a little tape that I whipped up at a local radio station where they cut jingles, and they had kind of a little terrible little recording studio. Not really. They had a tape recorder and a room and a microphone. So we went in there and did a few things, and I thought they were great because, you know, everybody in town thought we were great. So I said, well, we were great. And I got in my car by myself, and I drove to Hollywood and just started knocking on doors. I mean, how stupid. I actually thought I could make a record deal. And I did.
To land dance jobs and record contracts, acts had to be able to draw an audience. But conversely, bands had to have some level of popularity first. Many acts were very entrepreneurial. For example, the Wailers formed Etiquette Records and Valet Publishing, as well as nurturing and recording many other artists. Certainly a lot of Northwest acts self-released records and put on their own dances and shows.
You know, we were new in the business. We wanted to get out on the road. We had no idea how rough it was, or tough, you know. I mean, you didn't have a minute to yourself. And you'd have to do station breaks for them and do an interview, which, you know, got to a lot of people, and tell them that you had an album out and things like that. And if you didn't do that, it was all up to the record company to promote, and they can't do it all. And it's that personal touch when you get out and do that. So we did very well with that. Sold a lot of albums. Some of the things we did in the early days, you know, you make a lot of mistakes. We were, you know, like a couple of guys from Tacoma going down into that Piranha Bowl in Los Angeles, and trusting everyone, and we got taken advantage of a lot. We'd be sent out on the road, and of course the guy that booked us would get 10-15%, and he'd get his money in advance. And then we would go out on the road, and we didn't know enough to ask for the money first. And most of the time, they wouldn't pay it anyway. They would say, "No, you guys play, and I'll pay you afterwards." And we were taking checks. And then by the time we got back to Los Angeles to cash a check, of course, it was no good. So yeah, actually being out on the road and promoting, yeah, we promoted, but we actually lost money out there. I mean, the expenses and everything, and what we got paid just didn't make up for it.
Well, in our early days, we would go out and we'd rent little halls. And we put up our own posters, and, this was one of our first dances. Well, we didn't realize, word of mouth and posters, that there would be as many people showed up. About 200 people showed up to this dance that we had in a place that held 50 people. And I don't even know if we had a little sound. I think our sound system was a mic plugged into an amp.
We took stacks of penny postcards and to our classmates and passed them out, and they all wrote on there, "Play the Wailers song," from Sally from Stadium or whatever. So the stations started to get thousands of postcards, and I started playing it in town here at those two stations. I believe it was KOMO and KTNT, and they played it every 15 minutes, one side then the other. That forced Seattle to play it, and once Seattle played it, broke, and then it started breaking all over the country. So that's when Dick Clark called.
We were the band that was playing when the Blue Notes and the Wailers were out of town. When the Wailers were playing on American Bandstand, we were playing in the Armory that weekend that they were gone. We had the posters made when we made posters. We had several of them where we'd have the Wailers and the Princetons and the Blue Notes, all three of us having a battle of the bands, and it would be held at maybe like the Armory. We would only get maybe 20 or 25 posters made, but we would hang them up at Stadium High School. We'd get them out to Lincoln High School. We would have them at Frisco Freeze Drive-In, a popular place, Bush's Drive-In. We'd nail them on telephone poles in the local area, and then we would also run small ads in the Tacoma Tribune, and that's how we got the word out.
A box came in the mail when I was back in Idaho, and it's like, we really are on a record. And so I went around to record radio stations and got it. It wasn't hard because, somebody from Idaho actually made a record. Nobody had ever even dreamed that anybody could. So I got every radio station like that playing the record. Well, that immediately made all of our dances, the armories and wherever we were playing, we were packed solid because we had a record. We were like major deal. And so then it just started snowballing from there.
We would we'd rent the hall, we'd rent the cop, we'd get the permit. We would drive around to all the little towns and we'd tack up posters, and then we'd have Chuck's wife, Marilee, and Bob's wife, Betty. They'd always come and they'd, take the door. And that's how we made our money. And we actually made really good money. I was still, in school, just coming out of school, and actually ended up getting married and having a child, and while I was still in the group. But we lived really actually pretty well. Now, in those days, pretty well was $100 a week.
With absolute certain, a critical part of the Northwest scene was the proliferation of the teen dance circuit. The Spanish Castle, which Jimi Hendrix wrote about on his album Axis Bold as Love, located halfway between Seattle and Tacoma, was indeed a mystical and prestigious dance hall in the Northwest. But it seems like many other towns or cities in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska would have regular teen dances in roller rinks, armories, country clubs, fraternal organizations, schools, church halls, and even converted grocery stores. The dance scene was critical. as a constant demand for bands was there, and new acts kept forming to meet that demand, making way for kids in nearly every neighborhood to have a chance at rock and roll success.
The groups around here, a lot of them would put their own dances on. They figured out that they could rent a hall cheaply and print up some posters for a nickel a piece and hire a cop at the door and pretty much, charge the kids $1 a piece to get in. And if you don't have to do the math to figure out if you got a few hundred kids in the place, you're making some pretty good money for back then.
A couple of guys in the band, our bass player and our guitar player, their parents were military, so through there we got some jobs through them. We played at a community center at a place called Clear Lake Resort down in Eatonville. Just a small, very small little dance hall, probably didn't hold more than 75 or 100 people. But when I played down there, I thought I was playing the Los Angeles Coliseum.
The Wailers were that energy that started the Castle, and soon the Castle spawned several other dances that became the foundation of the whole Northwest music scene. Lake Hills Roller Rink in Bellevue, Parker's on Aurora, Linwood Rollaway Skating Rink, the Lundins out in Snohomish County, the Crescent Ballroom in Tacoma, later the AmVets Hall, the Rollaway Skating Rink in Olympia, Sheridan Park Hall in Bremerton, an occasional tour to Vasa Park down to Lake Sammamish. That became that Northwest dance circuit that continued to grow to the point that by 1966, we were in the summertime operating between 60 and 75 dances a week in the Northwest, which required an enormous amount of talent. So, which came first, the chicken or the egg? I don't know, but the dances were an enormous success. Everyone enjoyed them. We had to have bands to fill these venues. So there was the courage, it gave the courage for a young group that's music was beginning to develop to go ahead and buy the equipment and spend the time, because there was employment, there was exposure, there was gratification for the group if they arrived at that level and had that certain something.
Pat O'Day was one of the main disc jockeys, along with Dick Curtis. They were the ones that started the radio dances, where they hired, the first radio dance they had, I believe they hired the Wailers with Tall Cool One at the Spanish Castle. Pat O'Day, Dick Curtis. So they were heavyweights. They made each dance on the radio sound like it was the greatest dance in the history of the world. If you weren't there, you were going to miss it. Every dance sounded that way. I mean, if you could hear some of the old dance promos that they produced with Dick Curtis and Pat O'Day, were amazing.
I had the opportunity to join a group called the Statics with Tiny Tony, who were really coming on the scene at that time in 1962 in the R&B scene. And so we joined that group, and I played keyboards, and I sat down, at the keyboards and wore my dresses, and some guys from bands, back then, they would tell me that they used to stand in front of the stage and wait for me to forget about my knees together.
I wanted to play music so badly that when I first started playing the saxophone, that I could only go and play in taverns in downtown Tacoma. That's where I started playing with the Ventures, or had an opportunity to play with them on an occasion. And my father would come looking for me. He knew where I was, and he would travel the tavern circuit in the downtown area until he could hear me playing. He would never have to come in. He'd come in the tavern, and he would tell the bartender, "That kid is a minor. He's only 17 years old. He can't be in here." And I would get kicked out. Even though the bartender knew I was a minor, they'd let me in to play.
Well, there's always arguments. Dance comes to mind. We were playing up in Mount Vernon in a college dance up there one night. Our bass player and singer were having words. I forget what they were arguing about, but Paul made a comment over the PA system as he was bringing our singer Herman out onto the stage. Herman did not like the comment, and before you know it, they were up on the stage. We had a fist fight going right in the middle of the stage. They rolled off the stage, down onto the dance floor. They were out in the middle of the dance floor throwing punches, and there was about 500 or 600 kids standing around just watching it, and they thought that was the greatest thing they'd ever seen. But, you know, and the chaperones came in there and broke it up. I don't know, and we continued to play. We got back up on the stage, and the show went on.
The kids who would come to watch us were, for the most part, very well behaved, and they did not want any incidents to pop up to spoil their evening. Even if they were just dancing or watching the band, they helped maintain, well, they were their own crowd control.
Rock and roll music is another phase of the changes that come over this passing scene.
Oh, why don't you guys play something we can dance to? You know, we'd be playing, you know, and Mike Belzotti would be doing these, like, and then, you know, God looked out and sun looked across the sky, you know, and he made the world. Oh, you know, we'd make sounds with our voice, you know, we'd make voice sounds. There were no synthesizers. So we made this stuff up. You know, we did Oobleck was, all of us, it all started out with us making sounds. One guy was going, you know, chicka-booka-choo-choo, chicka-booka-choo, and somebody else would go, Oobleck, 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 Oobleck. And you know, I mean, 4 guys making weird sounds, and, you know, and I was, you know, muffling my guitar, you know, and I had this comb, and I go, oh my God, I mean, we were weird. You know, we'd make this stuff up in the garage.
Playing live with a rapidly appreciative audience was an experience that had no equal. Northwest acts would almost play anywhere, and live music was very accessible to their Northwest fans, and the groups gave them everything they had.
If you came off the stage and you were sweating and you were smiling, you were having a good time, that was it. You know, I mean, anything outside of that, you know, that was great. If they liked it and they loved it and they bought your records and they came to your gigs and all that, I mean, you know, I felt like we were doing our gig, you know.
Screaming, I mean, they wouldn't scream all the way through a song, but you'd start a song and they'd scream for the first minute, and you'd end a song and then they'd scream again. And you'd wave and they'd scream, and you'd smile and they'd scream, and it was, you know, it was really being like royalty. And the way you were treated by disc jockeys and other folks in the industry.
They would only pay us for 2 of us, and we wanted to get, you know, just 2 guitarists, and we wanted the experience of playing with the bass player and a drummer because we hadn't done that before. And so I think they paid us about $30 a night. And we split that 4 ways, so we're making $7.50 a night.
It was not uncommon for me to come home on a Friday night in the late 50s, early 60s with $50 to $75 in my pocket as my share of the income that the band made that night. So that was a tremendous amount of money for me when I was 17, 18 years old. In those days when my father maybe only brought home $125 a week. And he had to work 40 hours, and I would work 3 hours and make that kind of money.
There were many bands that were having good local success here and making good money that did not break out nationally. I lived totally off the money I got from the Regents. And even after I got married and had a child, I was still supporting the family on what I was making off the Regents, even without a hit record. So it was possible to make a living off of it. Then you had other bands, too, that were making very good money in this area, and they did not break out. And I've received many stories about how much some of these guys were making. It was a considerable sum in those days, making $800 a week. That was a lot of money. If you were in high school, you were like a millionaire.
I was getting paid for something that was fun, you know? first time in my life, I was earning some money from what little I knew. I didn't know much, but it was fun.
Beatlemania was everywhere in 1964, and the British invasion ruled top 40 radio for several years. And Northwest music changed, by many standards, for the better. There was less reliance on the saxophone. More original songs started emerging, and certainly the local band population expanded exponentially.
It's time now for much more music on the J.
The pop culture of the Northwest, because of the British invasion of 1964, are quite remarkable and easily distinguished.
It took everyone away from the soul. We had to make the transition. Ultimately, everybody had to make that transition from the rhythm and blues period to the pop rock period.
Well, being in the position we were in, we really got to play with a ton of these bands. The Searchers became friends of ours. The Zombies became friends. Peter and Gordon became friends. We were doing concerts with these guys because the British invasion was truly an invasion. You know, we went from playing all American rock and roll shows to playing half British, half American rock and roll shows. First time we played the McCormick Theater, or McCormick Place, in Chicago, it was all American. And the second time, not even a year later we played there, it was half British, you know. But those guys were great. First of all, they could drink you under the table, all right? But the jam sessions that would go on and the sharing, I think they were more open than Americans with what they were doing musically. You know, you could sit with a keyboard player from a Canadian group like the Guess Who, and he'd actually teach you stuff, give you a piano lesson. You could sit with the Searchers or the Zombies and sit and play guitar with them and teach each other stuff. American bands, you didn't do that. You'd jam with them, and you'd go out and, you know, play with them. But British guys, for some reason, wanted to sit in the dressing room with their guitar and work it out. I didn't have a problem with it.
The British invasion kind of just wiped out the saxophone playing, so to speak, because all it was guitars. That's all they had, was guitars. Saxophone playing was very few sax players back then. When the British invasion came, it was just like, no more sax.
Well, the British invasion really livened up what was going on in the United States. It really did. If it hadn't been for the Beatles and the Stones, we may have still been playing instrumentals to this day.
Of course, the big news worldwide was the escalation of America's involvement in the Vietnam conflict, starting in the early 60s. Common news stories of the day had taglines like student deferment, draft numbers, and body bags. But local Northwest music was a distraction to all of this. Bands would get restructured due to the draft, but the music soldiered on.
It was a combination of things. The social upheaval, the protests, the war, the drugs, everything together just seemed like overnight just changed the entire attitude of the whole United States. And it certainly wasn't an uplifting thing to go through. It was quite the opposite. It was depressing to see that happen. Bands were being broken up left and right by the draft. I stopped being a musician in '67 until I took it up again in late '95 because of the military.
The world was shrinking, and so everybody's influencing everybody else a lot more. Yeah, I'm sure the war had a lot to do with it because, you know, music, my feeling is that music is a reflection of what's going on. You know, you've got bands coming out of here that are singing about war, and you got bands all over the country singing about peace, and you got all of these different things that are huge festivals that are making, you know, world headlines. So the world was just shrinking, and I don't think there's anything specific that was changing music. Everybody influenced everybody else. Hunger, famine, party, feast, everything was being represented. It still is.
Playing music and entertaining people can be quite a deep bonding experience. Hours and days are spent with bandmates, sometimes in high-pressure situations. Money, or lack of it, enters the picture, and musical and other disagreements can be severe. But many musicians from the 60s will agree that the experiences from their musical adventures were some of the highlights of their lives. As in any successful creative endeavors, passion must be at the root. Music certainly evokes many kinds of feelings in many people. Early Northwest rock and roll was a world unto itself, and many creative, entrepreneurial, and passionate people made true art that will live forever.
We were loud, we were wild, we were young, lived for a while, and we drive anywhere just to chase a good time. We'd fight, we'd break up, get back together. Sure enough, we were hearts on fire, just taking a chance. We were kind of like my first band. Yeah, kinda like my first band. We weren't platinum, we weren't gold, but those aluminum cans in our hands were cold. Baby, we were each other's biggest fan. We believed it and we bought in, thought we were the best there'd ever been. Two kids talking about forever, stars in our eyes, didn't know any better. Love didn't go quite like we planned. Yeah, kinda like my phone. Snowball's chance, lottery long shot, pretty good run, but the wheels just fell off. I still think about you now and then. We were kinda like my first band. We did the whole fake it till you make it, but we never made it. Kinda like my first band. Yeah, kinda like my first band. Yeah, kinda like my first band. Two kids talking about forever, stars in our eyes, didn't know any better. Love didn't go quite like we planned. Yeah, kinda like my first. Snowball's chance, lottery long shot, pretty good run, but the wheels just fell off. I still think about you now and town. Welcome to our town. Tap on the shoulder, how do you do? A smile from a friendly face looks good on you. After all is said and done, there's a place for everyone. This is my town. This is your town. Welcome to our town. You see it time and time again, someone always lending a hand. This is my town. This is your town. Welcome to our town. And you can join the dance or take time to rest. Every season, no difference. You can blend in with the crowd or sing your song right out loud. This is my town. This is your town. Welcome to our town. Sometimes you will see a reminder why we're free. Take a good look around. You won't find a finer town. This is my town. This is your town. Welcome to our town. Yeah, this is my town. This is your town. Welcome to our town.
So here's like Viceroy kind of music. Early on would be like. And you try to look mean, like you really knew what you're doing. And then our hit was like. Granny's back. So it kind of was like kind of funky kind of stuff, but Little Sally T's was like sort of straight ahead rock and roll out. Well, there's a girl they call Little Sally T. She wants to love you, but she says a little later, please. Well, first she'll hold your hand and I'll give you that way I smile. I wanna hug and kiss you, but baby got to wait a while, while. Whoa, 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 little Sally, little tiny Sally T. Oh, she says she wants to love you, but she says a little later, please. Now, little Sally T. Very good.
My, oh my. There are things he could do. He could say I love you, but all I can say is, gee whiz.
I see the arrow looked up to the stars above, and it sang to a small guitar. Oh, lovely pussy, oh, pussy, my love, what a beautiful pussy, oh, you are. Oh, what a beautiful pussy you are. And that was Band in Boston, my friend.
Well, you know, I just play rhythm guitar, and Noki isn't here or Bob isn't here. So what I'm going to do is remind you of what Walk Don't Run sounds like. And it started out with the drums, you know, and then I came in with, and I'll just kind of hum it for you, you know, so you remember the melody. And then I start up.